Well, I'm somewhat overwhelmed by that introduction. But what I can say is that at least I think this talk will fulfill the requirement of being provocative. And also I was very interested because I hadn't really thought about how much relationship there is between what I'm going to talk to you about and what I have previously said about neural hermeneutics, which is something I've always said I'm going to do but never actually got around to. And I guess I should be defining what I mean by culture, but I prefer not to do that, but to let it emerge from the sorts of studies I'm going to talk about. But I guess the nearest I will get to that is to say it clearly depends on the interaction between the individual and the group. And I want to start with making the obvious point that there are two ways of learning about the world. We can learn by ourselves through trial and error, and we can learn from others, which to some extent means that we can avoid the errors. But of course, learning about the world from others has the potential to create shared norms of behaviour and the shared perspectives of experience as the basis of culture. So I think if you want to understand how culture emerges, then one of the things we should look at is how we learn about the world from others. And in particular, we can learn about the world by observing others. And there's a lot of work on this, and it's actually shown by almost all known animals. So foraging for food, characteristic of sticklebacks and starlings, gaze following, it's now not just in humans and primates, but has also been observed in ravens, goats, and dogs. Imitating actions, learning by watching the actions of others in mongooses, meerkats, primates. Fear conditioning by observation, certainly from classic experiments on monkeys and more recently in humans. That is to say, you learn to fear an object by noting that somebody else is afraid of it. And mate selection, which certainly exists apparently in fruit flies, guppies and quails, and probably in humans. So in the case of the fruit flies, the naive female fruit fly chooses mates by observing the males chosen by the experienced female fruit flies. No one has yet done proper experiments on humans to follow this up. Just to give you a couple of examples, this is from Kevin Leyland's lab. Sticklebacks use publicly available information from observing other sticklebacks. And there's an interesting relationship here between what the stickleback knows by itself. When it knows where the food is, it will go there. When it can no longer remember where the food is, which is a day or something like that, it then goes where the other sticklebacks go. So in a sense, observing others is the default when you don't know what to do yourself. Similar things in birds. These are these nice nutmeg mannequins. They will disregard their own information and follow the crowd even when the crowd is wrong. That sounds very much like humans, particularly in the stock market. And Kevin Leyland and his colleagues have done this interesting computer tournament where people sent in algorithms where they competed with one another to see to compare learning by trial and error by yourself and learning by observation. And what they found very clearly is that the algorithms that won depended entirely on learning from observation. So you see the proportion of success goes up dramatically as the amount of learning by observation goes up. Proportion of and likewise, if you just learn by yourself, the success goes down the more you do it. So strategies that relied on observation rather than trial and error proved to be remarkably successful. And one of the reasons that they're successful, of course, is that by observing others, they have already filtered out for you the best strategy. So you no longer have to worry about different alternatives. You can really see what turns out to be best. Now, of course, in many cases, learning by observing others actually involves mimicking them in some sense. That is, going where they go, doing what they do. And this certainly happens in humans. There's a great deal of interest in so-called mirroring. This is just one example. This is the evidence from Dinberg and colleagues in Sweden showing that when you see someone with a smiling face your smile muscle is activated, and when you see someone with a frowning face, your frowning muscle is activated. And this, interestingly, this happens even when the faces are presented subliminally, so that you're not aware of what expression you are seeing. Nevertheless, this imitation of expression occurs. You can obviously ask the question, what's the point of this? And the important thing is that this facial mimicry is not just some contagious overflow of emotion, it is actually useful in the Darwinian sense. In the more recent study, I should point out that most of the studies I'm going to describe to you are not by me. That's the advantage of being retired. Yeah. So this is a nice study. This is one of the best uses ever of MRI. That is to say, they put people into an MRI scanner to see what happens during the expression of disgust. And during the expression of disgust, your nasal cavity is compressed, which you can see in the MRI, structural MRI. So the case here is that the expression of fear, the widening of the eyes, etc., increased nasal volume actually enlarges the visual field, so you have increased vigilance, you're more capable of taking in external information. The expression of disgust has actually the opposite effect. You close your eyes, you reduce the visual field, your nostril volume is reduced, and this is, of course, to keep out noxious stimuli of various kinds. So imitating these expressions actually has an effect on the way you interact with the world. And indeed, the facial expressions are examples of what people call public information. They're cues inadvertently produced by behaviour of various animals that are useful to other animals, not necessarily the same species. And expressions of fear and disgust are signals of different kinds of danger. And by automatically imitating them, you're actually preparing yourself for these different kinds of danger. Now, imitation could create culture, but as I've shown you, this kind of imitation seems to be ubiquitous across nearly all animal species. So clearly it's not sufficient to create the kind of culture that humans have, which is vastly different, certainly from fruit flies, meerkats, and monkeys. So you could then ask the question, is there something different about imitation in humans? Is there another special kind of imitation? And again, exciting new work from people who are not me. I should also maybe point out that the way I construct these talks is to think of all the most exciting experiments I recently read and try and put them together into a coherent story. But anyway, this is one of them, the phenomenon of over-imitation. So it's originally done with children. They're presented with this puzzle box, direct descendant of Thorndike, and the adult demonstrates 4 stages prior to getting the food out of the box. So they have to push this rod out, and then they tap with the second rod on the top, then they pull this plug out, and then they can get the food out with this rod. Now the point of this is that steps 1 and 2 are entirely unnecessary to get the reward. Steps 3 and 4 are sufficient. But children imitate all 4 steps, and they will even do this when it's against their interests. So in the experiment from Lyons and colleagues, there was a glove puppet who was competing with them with a second puzzle box, and they had to get out the food quicker. And the glove puppet, as it were, cheated by leaving out steps 1 and 2, and the children tried to do it faster and faster, and they got very upset, but they still kept doing steps 1 and 2. Now, they've studied over-imitation in adults, and they've found that they over-imitate even more than children. And Andrew White and colleagues have done it with chimpanzees and showed that chimpanzees don't over-imitate. Once again, they are more rational. So what's all this about? And I think over-imitation is an interesting potential generator of culture, because this is learning not how to do things, but how we do things. And there's this nice quote from McDougall: "Most Englishmen would scorn to kiss and embrace one another or to gesticulate freely, if only because Frenchmen do these things." So the goal is not as important as the manner in which it is achieved. And we imitate because we want to be part of our in-group. But actually, before I go on to that, just to mention in passing, and I didn't think there's really enough time to talk about it properly, there's some interesting work by Antonia Hamilton looking at imitation And the suggestion is that to imitate meaningless gestures is difficult. Humans can do it, and it seems to depend on direct connections within the temporal lobe, which may be relatively, or at least much more highly developed in humans. It's not clear that animals, non-human animals, can do this imitation of meaningless gestures. But the other point, of course, is that we imitate because we want to be part of our in-group. And there's direct evidence from that. So in this case, I'm never quite sure how they get ethics to do these experiments, but the poor subjects are excluded by the in-group. And after they've been excluded by the in-group, they imitate more. They don't show this if they're excluded by the out-group, and they don't show this if there's no exclusion at all. So after you've been excluded, you will tend to imitate your in-group members more. And a similar result has been found by Over and Carpenter for children. So then you can ask the question, how do we learn from observing others? How do we translate what we see into what we do? This is about mirroring in brain and behaviour. And of course, mimicry is a form of alignment. We're automatically aligning ourselves with others, and I will show to you some of the evidence at least. We do this not just in terms of actions and expressions, but also in terms of goals, of knowledge, and beliefs. So this is Sarah Jane Blakemore, who I was instructed to mention. And there's a similar study from Tanya Singer, which I'm afraid I left out. But this is demonstrating how sensations are contagious. We share the experience of touch. So in this experiment, people were lying in a scanner, and either their face was touched, or their neck was touched, or they saw somebody else's face being touched, or somebody else's neck being touched, or they saw an electric fan being touched, and it vaguely looks like a face. And what you see here is those areas where you got overlap between activity when you were touched and when you saw someone else being touched in the same place. So this is in primary somatosensory cortex, and this lights up if you're being touched on the head and you see somebody else being touched on the head. This is secondary somatosensory cortex, and again this distinguishes whether you're being touched left or right or somebody else is being touched left or right. Now, the interesting feature of this experiment is that it was originally done as a study of synesthesia because our colleague Jamie Ward had discovered, as you do by giving lectures about synesthesia, afterwards somebody comes up and says, I thought everybody was like this. And in this case, he found two people who say, when I see somebody else being touched, I feel it on my own face, which is somewhat unusual. And we thought this is very interesting. You could scan them and see how this relates to the brain activity. But the interesting thing, what I'm showing you here is the control group. These are people who have never reported feeling the touch on their own face when they see somebody else being touched. The synesthetes show this to a slightly greater extent. But the striking thing to me is that, except in these rare cases, we're not conscious of this sensory activation, as it were, that comes from seeing other people, and shows how much more embedded we are in the world of others than we realize. Now, there's lots of work showing actions are contagious. You probably all know about the chameleon effect, which is this tendency to imitate the person we are having a conversation with. And there are similar studies from sort of cognitive psychology showing that your reaction time is influenced by somebody else moving, watching somebody else moving at the same time. And what I want to suggest to you is it's not just actions that are contagious, but also goals, knowledge, and belief. I'm only going to talk about one of these, but if you're interested, Natalie Sabantz has demonstrated this contagion of the goal of others, and Kovacs and Bayesian and various other people have recently shown that even infants down to 7 months seem to be influenced by the beliefs of others. But I want to show you simply this one experiment by Dana Sampson and colleagues about how the knowledge of others is contagious. So this is a very standard experiment, as usually performed, where you can ask the question, how many dots are there in this room? And you would say 2. How many dots can she see? And you would say 1. And I think it takes slightly longer to say how many dots she can see. The trick that Dana Sampson developed was never to ask the question, how many dots can she see? Simply to ask the question, how many dots are there in this room? And what she found was that when there is someone in the room who can see a different number of dots from you, you are slower to answer the question, how many dots are there in this room? In other words, the knowledge of the other person has interfered with your ability to report how many dots there are. And this effect is automatic in the sense that, well, first of all, in the sense that it's interfering with what you're trying to do. And secondly, the interference remains if you do it under cognitive load. So there's no role for cognitive load in this effect. This is something really automatic. And I'm interpreting it as showing that we are influenced automatically by the knowledge of others, and in a sense align ourselves with them. So recently we've been thinking about mechanisms for these contagious effects of other people, and there is an exciting new paper in Ticks about this, which has caused already enormous controversy amongst the embodied Gibsonian non-linear, non-representational philosophers who disapprove of this sort of thing. But anyway, the presence of others, what I'm suggesting in these simple cases, the presence of others alters our maps of affordance. We enter what philosophers like to call the we mode. And this is my attempt to illustrate this. So if you're sitting at this table which has all these mugs on, they will have different amounts of affordance, which I've illustrated by the brightness. So the bright cups have higher affordance because they're within reach of Mr. Blue. Now, the interesting thing about these affordance maps is that we know they are very malleable. So this is Atsushi Iriki's marvelous experiments on monkeys who are taught to use a rake. And he measures receptive fields in the parietal cortex, and in the normal case, these cells in the parietal cortex will fire when there's something near the monkey's hand. But when the monkey has learned to use a rake, then as soon as it picks up the rake, the receptive field expands so that the cell fires whenever there's something visible near the rake. And of course, if the monkey doesn't know anything about the rake or has forgotten it, it shrinks back again. So these receptive fields are very malleable, in this case because of tool use. And I'm suggesting that something very similar is happening with us in relation to affordance, where effectively other people are potential tools. So now, this mug here has high affordance for Mr. Blue because it's within reach of Mr. Red. And simultaneously with my thinking this, and I claim there was no contamination, Cardeliccio and colleagues have done an experiment very like this, where they had avatars and cylinders, and again they show using TMS that this sort of phenomena occurs. Things that are within reach of the avatar now become affordable to you in this sense. And finally, this is extremely speculative, but it could be tested. It seems to me that the Dana-Sampson experiment suggests that the affordance of this mug, which is within your reach, will go down simply because Mr. Red doesn't know it's there. That seems to me what's happening in the Dana-Sampson experiment. So it's showing how powerful these effects are of the people we're with in altering our map of the world, if you like. And these contagious effects of others make joint action and communication more efficient because of the alignment they create. And there are many experiments on this. I just want to give one example in relation to discourse. So this is Pickering and Garrod's suggestion about how when two people are talking to each other, you get alignment at all these levels. They start to use the same words and the same words and the same phonemes and the same situations and so on. And the more they do that, the better the communication will be. And there's I find a slightly comic example of this from people in the Netherlands, showing that if you imitate someone's foreign accent, it makes the communication easier. But I would strongly suggest that this doesn't work if they're aware that they are being imitated. So as with mimicry, alignment has the potential to create the shared norms of behaviour and the shared perspectives of experience that I suggest are the basis of culture. But how do we achieve such alignment? All I've really said so far is it happens. Now, to track the knowledge of intentions of others, we predict what they're going to do by running a simulation in our own motor system. This is the other half of the neural hermeneutics that Alfonso was mentioning at the beginning. If they do something different from what we expect, this is a prediction error, and we have to modify our assumptions. This is because I'm a born-again Bayesian. Now, this is a typical experiment from Rebecca Sachs's lab, where this person walks across the room, disappears behind this bookcase. You expect him to come out based on the speed that he's walking, and if he comes out after a delay, I would call this a prediction error, and you get an increased activity in temporoparietal junction or posterior STS, depending on what you like to call it. And for those, the cognoscenti among you, I apologize for the incredibly bad quality of this picture, which is the best I could get out of the paper that they published and is on the internet. But even so, as I said, the cognoscenti among you will recognize that this must be Dave Perrott, because there are little bits of color in his hair, and he, of course, was one of the co-authors. Here's another example from Tim Berentz, who I regrettably cannot claim as having influence in any way. He's using these models of prediction learning through prediction errors. He's comparing learning about reward from learning about people. So in this experiment, you had to learn whether the reward was behind the green or the blue door, and therefore you can get prediction errors if it's not behind the door you expect. You're also getting advice from a supposed collaborator in the next room, and again the advice is sometimes good and sometimes bad, so you can unexpectedly get bad advice or unexpectedly get good advice. You can look at the prediction errors, and the reward prediction errors, of course, are in the ventral striatum here, but the social prediction errors are typically in temporoparietal junction STS and medial prefrontal cortex, as we see in many so-called mentalizing studies. So this is linking this sort of prediction error model with all the stuff, the very phrenological stuff that we previously had on where the mentalizing system was. And here is an account from James Kilner, and I do indeed have my name on this paper, but I would beg you not to ask me to explain what these formulae mean. But this is the idea, this is the model of how the mirror neuron system, as it's sometimes called, might work. The original idea, this was a completely feed-forward model. You saw someone moving, it went to STS, and you somehow interpreted into an intention, into an action, and then into an intention. So simply by seeing the movement, you could somehow magically work out what the person's intention was. This is our alternative predictive coding system, which depends on feedback. So you actually perform a prediction, probably in the prefrontal cortex, about what the person's intention is. You can use your motor system to work out, given this intention, what would he actually do? You then watch what he does, and then at all these stages you can get prediction error. So if he doesn't do what you predict, prediction error comes in, and you have to adjust your idea of what his original intention was. And this is all explained in great detail in this paper if you wish to read it. So this is a predictive coding account of action perception. Now, I think the important part of this Bayesian approach to perception, in this case social perception, is that it always has two key components. That is the evidence, the sensations, the bottom-up information, and the prior expectations, the top-down information. And it is the interaction between these two that determines what you perceive. And I just want to give you this example to illustrate these two components, and in this case, how they relate to the experience of performing an action. So this is from Patrick Haggard's group. The task is very simple. You press a button, and 250 milliseconds later, there is a tone. And what you measure is using the technique invented by Benjamin Libet, is at what time did you have the experience of pressing the button? And this moves about, as you will know, depending on whether you deliberately cause the tone or not. And they were able to separate out these two components, the retrospective component relating to evidence and the predictive component relating to prior expectations. So in this case, you press the button, and sometimes the tone occurs, and 50% of the time the tone doesn't occur. And the interesting thing here is that if the tone occurs, your experience of when you press the button is later than if the tone didn't occur, and this effect must be caused by what happened, whether the tone occurred or not. So it's retrospective, and this is the evidence telling you what has actually happened. Now the other comparison is here, where you press the button and no tone occurs, compared to the situation where you have learned from prior experience that it's rather unlikely that this will happen. That is to say, 75% of the time when you press the button the tone occurs, but 25% of the time when you press the button it doesn't occur. So when you compare this situation where you have a 50-50 expectation to this situation where you have a high expectation that the tone will occur, you get the shift in the experience of when the tone occurred is greater when the tone is highly expected than when it's not highly expected, even though the tone doesn't occur in both cases. So this is the effect of the prior expectation on your experience of pressing the button. So that's just to illustrate these two distinct points. Now in this case, of course, the prior has come from the many, many trials you've had before, from which you have learned that the tone is likely to occur 75% of the time. Now, Carl Friston, of course, has a much more complicated model of this Bayesian predictive coding system, which I'm absolutely sure is correct because he has told me so many times. And this is a hierarchical Bayesian model. So you have the simple idea that I've already described to you. You have evidence coming in, you have prior expectations, and when you combine the two, you can get a prediction error. How much does the evidence reflect what you expected? But now this prediction error becomes the evidence for the next one up in the hierarchy, and so it goes on and on. And you can imagine this in the case of reading, where at the bottom of the hierarchy you might have to say, what is the graphic shape, what is the letter that these graphic shapes represent? And the Bayesian system would work, and then you can say, what is the word that these letters go together to form? And then you can say, what are the sentences that these words go together? And at each case you can have an independent prediction error, so you might get a perfectly good word, but then it doesn't fit the sentence. And then you have to go right back to the bottom and say, maybe I misread the graphics. So that would be an illustration of this hierarchical scheme. But the question I want to ask you, rhetorically I should say, I don't want anyone to answer it, is what's at the top? We're going up and up the system. Right at the top there is some prior that is going all the way down and influencing everything that's happening below. And you can rephrase this, and we talked about this in this exciting paper here. And the question is, what's at the top in top-down control? Or later, now that we are Bayesians, where do the priors come from at the top? And the answer, of course, in the psychology lab, the experimenter, and in the real world, other people, and therefore culture. Let me give you an example of how the experimenter can be the top-down controller in a simple experiments on vision. This is nostalgic for me because these are amongst the earliest brain imaging studies using PET scanners in 1991. And this was an experiment by Semir Zeki, which is bottom-up passive viewing. The subjects lie in the scanner, they're just told to relax and keep their eyes open, and they're presented either with coloured pictures or exactly the same pictures with the colour removed. And when you compare the two, you get activity in V4, the so-called colour area. This is a bottom-up experiment. At the same time, Maurizio Corbetta did a top-down active viewing experiment. So in this case, the critical thing is that the stimuli presented to the subject are identical. But in one case they're told to attend to colour, the other case they're told attend to shape, and when you do the difference, again you find activity in V4, and it seems to be very clear in this case that the top-down signal is the experimenter who's telling the subjects attend to colour. That's what causes V4 to light up. It's the experimenter that causes it. Yeah. And now I think this is really where I think culture and the brain mechanisms underlying it comes in, because humans are unique in the ability to reflect on their actions and experience and discuss these reflections with others. And discussion very easily turns into instruction. And it's this explicit learning from others that is the basis of cumulative culture. And discussions with others creates these top priors which have their top-down effects on behaviour and experience. And I want to finish by giving you some examples I find really quite striking of how these top-level discussions and instructions, how low they can go in changing our behaviour and experience. I don't mean low in the moral sense, I mean low in the neural sense, though sometimes it's in the moral sense too. So this is, for example, just one example, the power of gossip. Everybody knows that gossip is the most important human ability that we have. Dunbar has told us this. So this was an example of a trust game where you're playing against people and you invest money in them and they may pay it back or they may not pay it back. And you learn how trustworthy they are. And there are many experiments of people learning how trustworthy people are, and you get reward prediction errors in the ventral striatum, and through learning what they do, if you learn that they're untrustworthy, then you stop giving them money and so on. That's very straightforward. But what was interesting in this experiment from Delgado and Liz Phelps's lab is that in some cases they were told in advance this is a trustworthy person or this is an untrustworthy person. And what was interesting is this effectively overrode both the learning, both the behaviour, so that they didn't learn as much from what the person actually did compared to someone they didn't know anything about, and also in the amount of activity we saw to the reward prediction error. In other words, telling them in advance how trustworthy the person was reduced the effect of the evidence which is manifest both in behaviour and in the brain activity. And this has very recently been replicated by these people, and I'll come back to that later. The other thing I find very exciting, and is again not by me, is how discussions of the experience of action can alter subsequent behaviour. So this is this well-known phenomenon of ego depletion, the idea being that we have a limited resource. And in this case, one group was instructed, working on a strenuous mental task can make you feel tired such that you need a break before accomplishing a new task. And after this, they replicated the result that if you'd had to do something difficult or sit next to marshmallows and not eat them, you made more Stroop errors afterwards. But the nice feature of this experiment is they had a second group who were told sometimes working on strenuous mental tasks can make you feel energized for further challenging activities. And the effects were striking, so that the people who were told they would be energized actually made fewer Stroop errors after they'd had to not eat marshmallows or whatever it was, or do a hard executive task. So in this case, the people's beliefs about what effect the task would have on them altered their behavior. Now you can ask, I like to speculate, I don't think the authors do, what is this all about? And I think presumably there are cues. You actually feel things after you've been doing a difficult executive task, conceivably something like increased heart rate, but you can learn, what does this mean? You might learn it means I'm feeling tired, or you might learn it means I'm feeling energized. That would be the sort of model I would like to pursue to explain these sorts of results. And now, this really is some of my own work, or to be more accurate, some of Bahadur Barami's work, demonstrating it's not just discussions of action, but also discussions of perception that can create group advantages, enhance individual performance, and also create interesting alignments. So this is our work on social psychophysics and demonstrating that two heads are better than one. You'll be glad to know. So the task, as you can immediately see, is a two-interval oddball contrast detection task, where in one of the two intervals there's an odd one out amongst these 6 Gabor patches because it has a slightly different contrast from the other. So the two subjects working together, looking at different screens, they see the two stimuli, they make individual decisions by pressing buttons on their computer. If they disagree, they then have a discussion and come up with a joint decision, and in the original experiment they were then told whether they were right or wrong, which also indicates who was right the first time round. You can measure very accurately, using typical psychophysics, the steepness of this curve, which is how good you are depending on the contrast difference between the oddball and the others, and the steepness of the curve is a measure of how sensitive you are to the distinction. And this is obviously the best pair, where the blue and the yellow are the individual subjects, and the red is the performance of the dyad, which you can see is steeper and therefore better. And this is the result from 16 subjects, where the performance of the dyad is significantly better than the performance of the beta member in each dyad. So there's clearly a group advantage in this boring psychophysical task. I should add, if there are any psychophysicists here, there's a huge advantage of this sort of work, because if you do this on a single person, they get very bored, and you will have noticed that many psychophysics experiments have 3 authors who are also the 3 subjects. If you do it in pairs, they really enjoy it, and you don't have this problem. Now, there are all sorts of questions that horrible referees asked, like, is it really the discussion that's important, or was it the feedback? And that was quite interesting, because the results clearly showed that if you had discussion and no feedback, you still got the group advantage. And if you had no discussion but feedback, you didn't get any group advantage at all. The interesting thing here is that they apparently got a group advantage even though they didn't know whether they were right or wrong. So that suggests by working together we can actually learn things about the world without needing such obvious feedback. The question obviously you want to ask is, how do they combine their information so successfully? And Bahadur and friends came up with this weighted confidence sharing model, which basically means they have to say to each other, I thought it was the first interval and I had this degree of confidence, and the other person has, and they have to take into account how confident they were on each interval, on each answer, and roughly speaking, if you choose the more confident person on each trial, you'll probably do better, and this can certainly eliminate those trials where one of you actually missed it. But the interesting thing is, if you do the maths, you come up with quite a simple formula about what the result for the dyad should be, given the sensitivity of the 2 participating people. And you can then plot this in this complicated way, which I won't go into, except to say on this axis you have the relative ability of the 2 people. So at this end they're both equally good. At this end, one of them is much worse than the other. The weighted confidence sharing model predicts, as you would expect, that when they're relatively similar they get a group advantage, but unexpectedly it predicts that when they're very dissimilar you actually get a group disadvantage, and this indeed happened with real data. In this case we created fake disabilities by putting noise into one of the people's signal and not the other. So the red line is what is predicted by the weighted confidence sharing model, and the blue line is the best fit through the data. And I think Bahadur likes to point out this model doesn't have any parameters. It just has the 2 sensitivities of the 2 people. So through discussion, 2 or presumably more people can create a more accurate picture of the world than the best on their own, even without feedback. This depends obviously on the ability to introspect upon your own performance, say how confident you are, metacognition, and also to convey this experience to each other, communication, in a way that somehow aligns their confidence. So obviously the question you can ask is, what do they actually say to each other? Now I presume, as in the UK, you have all been watching these Danish thrillers on TV, so you will understand all this. But basically they talk to each other. But what happened was that Fusaroli and Tulén had something like 200 hours of video, which they then transcribed into words and did an analysis of, which is really marvellous of them. So this is the sorts of thing that people said. And when they analysed it, they could show that through their discussion, the pairs developed from scratch fine-grained verbal scales averaging at about 18 items for indicating how confident they were on each trial. So they had a confidence scale of about 18 steps. Each pair developed a different scale in terms of the precise words used. Virtually none of them used numbers. They used words. And interestingly, the better they did this, the more they came up with they homed in on a scale, the greater the group advantage was. and the more they talk to each other about confidence rather than something else, the greater, and align their ways of talking about confidence, the greater the group advantage was. So, as I said, the greater collective benefit was achieved by pairs who, as they put it, mutually adapted to each other's linguistic expressions of confidence and developed stable sets of expressions and constituting scales for sharing and comparing confidences. And interestingly, and this is unpublished, I hope it may be eventually, confidence sharing of this kind actually improves individual perception as well. So these are people who just did the task all on their own. These are people who did it with somebody else. And these are people who did it with somebody else and didn't get any feedback. And you can see very early on, within the first 64 trials, people who are working together, it actually improves their individual ability. And of course, obviously our brains that give us this ability to reflect upon our actions and experience and discuss these reflections with others. Through these discussions, we develop explicit accounts of the world and ourselves. And I suggest that these accounts are the basis of cumulative culture. Now, and let me give some more examples of this. Discussions of the nature of how we control our actions, e.g. the existence of free will, can alter low-level cognitive processes. So people's belief in free will was undermined by telling them things like this. Most rational people now recognize that free will is an illusion. F. Crick, Nobel Prize winner. This is the effect from these marvelous experiments from Marcel Brass's group. The amplitude, after you've been the group that's been told that there's no free will, the amplitude of their readiness potential, that is the potential that occurs just before you make a voluntary response, is significantly reduced. This is the famous post-error slowing. When you're doing a reaction time task, if you make an error, you tend to be slower on the next trial, which is obviously a voluntary control of what you're doing. The interpretation of this is that Francis Crick is telling people we don't have so much voluntary control over our actions as we thought. And in here again, the group who are told they don't have free will, after the manipulation, there's a great reduction in post-error slowing. These are very low-level, it seems to me, neural properties that are being affected by this very high-level prior given by somebody else, in this case, that we don't have free will. So are there cultural differences in the experience of agency? And I managed to find just one example that suggests there might be from this interesting book by Levinson, which includes a paper here by Danziger, who studied the Mop and Myers of Central America. And they are striking because punishment is applied equally if the outcome is accidental rather than deliberate. Doesn't matter. If it was a mistake, it's still punished equally. Saying a falsehood is not excused even if at the time the speaker believed it to be true. Children who indulge in pretend play are reproved. In other words, I interpret this as saying the intention behind the action has no importance. It's just the action that counts. I would strongly predict, and I hope someone will go and test this, that their sort of Libet Haggard type attentional binding may be reduced. They may show the sorts of things you saw in those experiments on telling people they have no free will. So this, it seems to me, would be an example of a cultural effect of these kinds of beliefs upon experience of agency. The creation of culture, our ability to share our experience of the world and of ourselves, depends on, I suggest, introspection or metacognition, communication and alignment, and top-down inferences or priors. Now, of course, I have said very, very little about the brain, and I guess I would claim that I am at the moment more interested in spelling out or suggesting the kinds of mechanisms that may be involved, which we might then be able more sensibly to look for in the brain. Nevertheless, there are some interesting papers, again, some favourite papers being put randomly together, suggesting that frontopolar cortex might have a special role in these properties I've talked about that are necessary for creating cumulative culture. So this Foranyan, if that's how you pronounce it, paper, is specifically written in terms of priors. So they're doing this trust game, and they've learned in advance that certain people, they've been given prior knowledge about their trustworthiness, and other people they haven't. And they find activity in this part of BA10-ish when they're confronted with someone who they have a prior for compared with someone who they don't have a prior for. So this is more active when there is a high-level prior available. This is the metacognitive processing which Jason Mitchell was involved with, where people were asked to indicate how much control they had over their own actions. And again, this area of BA10 is more active when they're trying to introspect about their agency, example of metacognitive processing. This is a study from Steve Fleming where he measured people's metacognitive accuracy, that is to say, how, when they say they are confident, are they usually right? And this is a structural difference, so people who are better at metacognitive accuracy, have more metacognitive accuracy, have more grey in this particular part of BA10. And finally, and most obscurely, is the work by Wako Yoshida, who did this stag hunt game, which critically depends on two people aligning themselves and believing that they're both going to cooperate with each other, which is necessary to do this game. And the maintenance of cooperation and the ability to, in this case, recognize whether I am accurate in inferring the depth of recursion. If you want to know about this, read the paper. Activates this again, this area of BA10. So these are, interestingly to me, studies relating to the sorts of processes I've been talking about, which seem to me to be necessary for things like metacognition, communication, and alignment. And they seem to be clustering in this area of BA10, frontopolar cortex, which of course some people believe is the bit of the human brain that is most developed amongst the primates, although this remains controversial. It's certainly at the top of a hierarchy of control in frontal cortex. And of course the real top, as I said before, is out here with other people and culture. Now I want to finish, this is really my second to last slide, which is sort of fanciful thought about all this. We know, roughly speaking, that the human brain has not changed in any fundamental way over the last 40,000 years or so. But human behavior and experience have changed dramatically. For example, we can all read and drive cars and things like this. And since the human brain is very plastic, these differences will be reflected in brain structure and function. We know that reading creates structural changes in the brain. We know that driving taxis in London create structural changes in the brain. In other words, it is culture that is creating the adult human brain just as much as the brain is creating culture. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Now we're going to have a commentary by Mahzarin Banaji, who is the Richard Clark Cabot Professor of Social Ethics in the Department of Psychology.
Thank you, Alfonso. I'm Mahzarin, and I'm very pleased to be a small part of this MBB event honoring and featuring Chris Frith. I think it's fair to say that Chris Frith is sui generis. He is in a class by himself in the way in which he's gone about selecting a set of problems that he has studied, but especially in the way in which he goes about marshalling evidence for his ideas. Today, you saw some of this wide-ranging cataloging of evidence to make the case that all living beings have a remarkable ability to learn from others, and that humans have a perhaps unique ability to do so because our species has access to the golden path of explicit, conscious, and reflective learning. And this might even include the ability to choose not to learn or to choose not to imitate. So let me start with an observation of just how unremarkable human beings are, and I'll start with a comparison to stickleback fish, a pugnacious, spiny-backed fish, which does the following. A stickleback fish, if it knows through private knowledge that food exists, say, on the right side of a tank, and has learned that, will perform the following interesting behavior when removed from the tank, sent off on vacation, and then brought back a week later. If when it is reinserted into the tank and it sees a bunch of other stickleback fish sitting, let's say, to the right side of the tank, it will go there rather than to the left where it knew there was food. In other words, its own private knowledge is not as important as the knowledge that there are other creatures that now sit somewhere else. It regards its own knowledge that was old as unreliable. Okay? Now, already the stickleback fish is ahead of the United States Supreme Court, which continues to bang its nose up against old and unreliable information, and quite literally until they die, they keep doing this. So in the interest of time, I'm going to restrain myself to just one strand from Chris's very rich and thought-provoking talk and pose a few questions through the lens of my own understanding of social learning. Chris told us that all species are capable of implicit forms of learning. And there are many of these kinds of implicit forms of learning, and we have them, and so do other species. But in addition, that there is this thing called explicit forms of learning that seem to be unique to humans, and that's something that Chris has linked up to this concept of metacognition. So the question I want us to think about is, okay, if we learn implicitly from others, the question is, which others do we learn from? Obviously, I would say from the ones that we have access to. And I say access to, not the ones who are near us, because it is true that in our ancestral past, the ones we learned from would have been people, a very small set compared to what we have today, of others who were genetically closely related to us and socioculturally quite similar to us. That is to say, they would have borne physical resemblance to us, and they would have made the same grunting noises in response to the same things that we liked and they liked. But now, of course, the group of people from whom we can learn is incredibly more diverse. I was a girl from South India who packed up a bag and showed up to this country 33 years ago to learn about a field that I knew nothing about from people who were completely alien from me. And yet, even though we've expanded the group of people from whom we learn and who we use as models, I have been struck by just how harsh the limits of social group membership actually are. As a small example, I give you a study that Liz Spelke and I did that was led by Kristen Schutz, in which Kristen looked at children as young as age 3, showed them two models. One model would say something like, I like spoodles, spoodles are my favorite thing to eat or wear. Another kid would say, I love blickets, blickets are my favorite thing to eat or to wear. And then we would ask the child, what do you want? What do you want to eat or wear? Spoodles or blickets? And what we did, of course, was to vary who those models were. So either the models were a girl and a boy, and the subject was either a girl or a boy. We varied so that the models were either older or younger people. We varied whether the models that they saw from whom they could learn were either racially same or racially distinct. And what Kristen's work showed was that who that other is matters when it's something like gender. So girls, to 80% on 80% of the trials, will imitate or choose the very thing that another girl chose. Boys do that too, but to a much lesser extent. They also choose very much what another young child chose. They don't trust the choices of adults as much as they trust the choices of people who match them in age. But interestingly, Kristen showed, and other people have shown similar results, like Lida Cosmides and others, that race didn't matter to kids. So to white kids, whether the model was black or white did not matter at all. Okay? So this is just one little example. I'm going to give you a second kind of an example of studies that I have had a hard time getting my head wrapped around, and listening to Chris made me think I should impose them on you and have you think about them with me. As some of you may know, I've been involved in using implicit measures of preference. How do we form associations between categories and attributes. Categories like social groups, be they male, female, black, white, elderly, young, gay, straight, whatever it might be, and properties of strong or weak, tall or short, good or bad. And we have methods that we can use to pull this out without asking people to reflect on how they feel about these groups, and rather by looking at their response latencies and the errors that they make, we can derive some kind of a rough indication of the strength of implicit associations in their minds. What we found, and I'll tell you this rather quickly, so I hope it's clear, what we found is that in adults, let's say we have a certain pattern. Let's say that white adults, 80% of them show a faster association of white with good rather than black with good. But surely at some point this got learned. So we began to ask the question, at what age? Do you want to predict at what age? The youngest kids we could test with this method were age 6. What age would you say this association is in place? Okay. Chris says 3, which is actually the right answer. And the right answer, so first of all, we saw it in 6-year-olds at the same level as we see in adults. No complete developmental invariance, okay? So what we see in adults is exactly what we see in children, no different in everybody in between. So then we said we've got to find a better way to go even younger, and we found a way. We went to age 3. Okay? So we find again the same thing. Now at age 3, they're looking just like adults in their in-group preference. So we thought, well, maybe it's kids in this country who are odd. Let's go to another country. So we went to Taiwan. And in Taiwan, we find the same thing, except in the opposite way. They show preference for others. They associate positive things with their group compared to, so in this case, the faces are Asian or white, and they show a nice, strong preference for Asian rather than white. All of this led me to think, first of all, this was surprising that it should be present in the adult form at that age. But it made me think there's obviously no protracted social learning that's going on, as social psychologists had thought for a long time, that whatever this is, it's in place, and it's in place very, very early, almost leading me to think maybe this is going to be present in the first month or so after birth in some form or another, not in this particularly complex form. Okay? But here are the data that made me make me pause. If every group shows a preference for its own, compared to the other, then we should see it pretty much everywhere. We do not see it in certain groups. We do not see it in members of disadvantaged groups. So black adults in the US and black adults in South Africa do not show the same in-group love or the in-group preference that we see in other group members. Okay? Only about 40% show that as compared to the 80% that we see in other groups. So what should 3-year-old black kids show? At some point they must learn that their group is not the cool group. Okay? And we find this in 3-year-olds, suggesting that there is some kind of learning. This is not just if there was something simple, strong in-group preference that's ubiquitous, then we should see strong in-group preference at the age of 3 in everybody, and maybe later you start to veer around based on what you're absorbing from your culture about what's the good group to be in and what's not the good group to be in. But the fact that black kids at age 3 look identical to black adults, and white kids at age 3 look identical to white adults is interesting, and I think of this as the big thumbprint of culture on our brain. Right? So I'm going to only say a few more things and bring us to a close. Look, there are many hard problems of seriously complex learning that the experimental evidence does not even touch on yet. Deciding whether to marry at the age of 21 or to establish a career. Whether to carry an accidentally conceived baby to termination or not. Whether to join the army because other people in your group have told you that that's a good way to get a free education. Whether to keep and use a prized hunting rifle that was handed down to you with great love from a great-grandparent. Whether to stick to the religion that you were born into, to switch to another one, or to abandon it altogether. These are all things that have some basis in learning. And one of the interesting things that if Chris and all these people who've taught us about social networks are right, then people who think similarly on these should hang around in similar ways too. And yet, on the other hand, I'm telling you that the world is becoming a much more diverse place. So there is a book that I read some years ago that has stuck with me. It's called The Big Sort. And this book argues that if you look at least the United States from the 1970s through now, what you see is that when people move to different parts of the country, they're not just moving to the way they used to move, which is to go look for the socioeconomic neighborhood into which they fit. Now they do that, but they do one additional thing. They also look for other people who are liberal or conservative, depending on who they are. So what used to be a lot of purple in the country has turned into little pockets of bright red and bright blue, because we no longer want to live around people who think differently from us along these political dimensions. And I think it raises an interesting kind of question of what that's going to do to these forms of learning that Chris has said something about. I'm going to end by raising an issue that will resonate with everybody in this room, who was in Boston, in Cambridge, or in Watertown these past 2 weeks. It's the question of identity formation as the path to learning and doing things. There is a 19-year-old who went to school not far from here, a few blocks from here, at Ringen Latin. Surely he had amazing models right there of teachers and peers who did amazing things every day, and where I can tell you that the student body is not homogeneous. In that student body, there are probably over 100 countries represented from which the parents come. So in no way was this kid one of a kind, different because everybody else was 12th generation German or English. That's simply not the case. But something happened, some kind of learning based on beliefs that came to him from some place did take hold in a certain way, and we saw in this case an example of the downside of an identity gone wrong. But every single day, there are many examples of learning where identities go right in a million different ways that tend not to get the same attention because they're not that attention-grabbing. It turns out that there is, for example, fabulous hip-hop music that's being created in Mongolia. This is by Mongolian kids who have nothing else in common besides hip-hop with Nicki Minaj. They must know nothing else about her culture or who she is, but there they are doing something that they've learned through the internet and producing new forms of it that are quite amazing. All of this brings me to something Chris Frith has said in his papers, that it's these explicit forms of learning that distinguish humans from the implicit forms of learning that we share with other species. Indeed, we might say that civilization is really, in essence, the making of that which is implicit into something that is explicit, so that the choice of whether to learn or not learn is possible. And I want to thank Chris for showing us that that's possible. So thank you, Chris.
Chris has agreed to take a few questions, if there are.
There's the microphone.
So you spoke a little bit about psychophysics, and as a psychophysicist, I have this question on Bahadur's work, and the reason is that I don't know when I'm going to meet him next, so I'll ask you. So you spoke about the only two factors is sensitivity of each subject, and I'm looking at it from a signal detection theory point of view, that you have two distributions of noise and signal plus noise, and the sensitivity is how far these two distributions are, but there is something else, and it's that your criterion level, where you put your criterion. So what goes into confidence, besides the sensitivity, is where you put your criterion, and I don't see that.
But in this particular, it's a forced choice task, so that isn't it criterion free?
Well, the criterion could move trial by trial. Just,
Yes.
I mean...
But no, I think I can't answer that question, but cleverer people than me worked out that formula. We are currently very interested in trying to explore confidence directly, because in this case it was entirely done on the basis of these sensitivity measures. And Bahadur and colleagues have started asking people their confidence as well, to see how this relates. So we'll get more information on that.
I'd like to thank Chris and Mahzarin for their presentations, and of course Dr. Frith and Steve Hyman, who couldn't come today. He had another conference to go to, for their written presentations. Thank you very much.